practical application of Boto3. Okay, with a relevant example. Anyone know what exactly is a Boto3? So Boto3 is the AWS SDK for Python. But can anyone tell me in simple language what exactly is SDK means all about, or what do you mean by this? I mean, in simple, plain language.
Like SDK software development kit, like for like specific platform, if we want to develop some code, so like it give us all the like what you call it, it give us all the libraries and everything so that we can use them and like build for that specific platform. Just like this is AWS, so we have for AWS platform, we have all the libraries are there, so we can build the like specific code for AWS.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. Thanks, Himanshu. Yeah. Let me try to explain this into a more simple terms. So let's say this is my AWS account, right? So first thing which you need to do is like you need to go to this log or sign into the console, right? I can give the username, password. Okay. So what I'm trying to do it over here, right? I first go to the AWS management console, right? I pass my username and password, right? And then whatever service I need to interact, let's say in this case EC2, just giving you one example. If I try to interact with the EC2, I just clicked on that EC2, right? And in this way, I reach to the particular EC2 console. Okay, simple. Now, this is fine if I need to interact with this with the help of a UI. So rather than doing all these interaction using the UI, if I need to do it programmatically, right? I need to write a script in which I need to perform these tasks. So let's say a simple task, I can give it to you. I need to check the number of running instances in this EC2. In this particular account, how many number of instances which is in the running state. Or I need to find it out like the AMI which is present in here, or security group or anything, right? So those things, rather than going log into the console, select the particular service, get the information, I want to perform all these tasks programmatically. And that is where you can use SDK, software development kit. And the module which enables us to do all these things is called Boto3, which is a Python SDK for AWS. And under the hood, it uses something called protocol. We are going to see it later, but just giving you an example, like even if you are aware of AWS CLI, under the hood, it is calling this protocol library to get the information for you. Okay. So let's see with the help of this, with the help of practical example, but remember 2 points. First, we need to go to this AWS management console, and then we need to select the service, right? Which can be anything, which can be EC2, S3, Lambda, whatever service you want to interact. Lambda. So that thing, we are trying to replicate it with the help of some of the program or script. Okay, so let's see. Let's go to our Python console. And the first thing which we need to do in order to use any module is to import it, right? And like I mentioned here, the way we have interacted with the AWS console is that we first need to go to that console. So how we can go to the console in case of Boto3? I need, let's say, I created this variable Boto3.session, and this is how I'm interacting with the AWS management console via the UI. But Boto3, I'm interacting it like this. Okay. Do any one of you recognize that when I am doing this, there's one piece of a puzzle which is missing over here? When I logged into when I go to this AWS Management Console, I need to supply a username or a password, right? But here, I'm not giving any username or a password. Do you guys know where it is going to get that username or a password information? So there's something called AWS configuration. Where you need to configure your AWS access key and secret key. So basically, this is telling AWS, okay, use this key under the hood. So think of this access key as a username and secret key as a password. And this is how, and by default, they will create a session for you, which is called a default session. So if you do not supply anything, is that it will use that default session to interact with your AWS console. There is also an option, for example, let's say you have a different session. So you have one account which is for dev, one account which is for prod. So in that case, you can create a different profile depending upon your requirement. And you need to create a different profile, like given a different access key for this dev environment, different secret access key, all those information. But your Boto3, by default, it understands that default profile. Okay. So what exactly you need to do? In that case, you need to change this thing. And here you need to supply profile underscore name is equal to dev, whatever the profile you have built. Any questions so far before I move to the next part? Because this is really critical. And one thing I want to show you, Python 3, Python Boto3 talk. You need to go to this available services. Guys, this is really critical page. If you are going to interact with Boto3, this is one place where you need to go and look for all the information. So let me ping you this one. And let's say, because we are talking about EC2, so let's go to EC2, right? And here you will see you have a different, all these methods which is supported by this EC2, which we are going to see it now. You see that why when importing Boto3, they are doing something called this client, which we are going to see just in few seconds. So by default, if you look at this Boto3 documentation, they are assuming that you will start with the default profile. And that's why in all the, if you look at any of these services or any of the methods supported by Boto3 or this EC2, they are not creating this console access. So just be careful. So in case if you want to create your own profile, you need to supply the profile name. Otherwise, if you are going to use the default session, you don't even need to specify this line. So now you have reached to the AWS Management Console, right? And the way we have seen, once we reach to the AWS Management Console, the second step is we need to select a service. Like I mentioned, we can select any of these services. And the way you are going to select this service is via the two ways. One is called client, and second way is called resource. Anyone know what is the difference between a client versus resource? I mean, this is one other interview question which they ask us frequently during the interview. What is the difference between a client versus resource? I've already showed you here that we are scheduling a session via the client. So and if you look at here, in any of the documentation, they will mention client and then resource. What is the difference between the client versus the resource? Okay. So in order to understand that, let's go to AWS Management Console and do the DIR. And what DIR is going to do, it's going to show us all the methods or objects supported by this particular thing, right? So if you see here, there is something called get available resources. We'll say AWS Management Console, get available resources. Okay, you see, we got some handful of resources over here. And similarly, get available resources, we have something called get available services. Get available services. And you see, I mean, there are a lot and lot of services which is being supported. So one of the major difference between a client versus resource, that resource only support handful of services. Or if you go to this AWS Management Console, you see that we have a bunch of services, right? So client, this resource only support a handful of these services, right? Whereas this client method support almost everything which is available on AWS console. Not everything, but almost everything. Okay. So if any new functionality or any new services which AWS is introducing, that goes under this client. Even the existing one. So if you see here, so let's say this, not let's say this resource supporting EC2, right? Even inside EC2, if you go to the EC2, you have like bunch and bunch of things which has been supported, and we are going to see one of those in one of the example which is coming soon. You have a lot of functionality which is supported by EC2. So not all these functionalities supported by the resource, but it is supported by a client, this client method. Now, what is the point of using the resource then? If everything is supported by client, why we need to use a resource, right? Anyone know why we need to use a resource over client? Okay. I mean, that I can show you with the help of one practical example, but client give you a low level information, which is in the form of a dictionary and which is difficult to parse. Whereas dealing with resource is pretty much easy. And that we are going to see with the help of one example right now. Okay. So before I move further, any questions so far? Okay. I will take this as a yes. Now, how to create these resource or a client, right? That's the second question. So I will take as a variable as AWS resource and AWS Management Console, the session which we have already established, right? And I need to specify resource. Let's say EC2. And similar thing, I can do it for client. CLI. I mean, I can give any variable. And rather than using a resource, I can use client. Okay. Now, if you do dir of this EC2 underscore resource, you see all the method which is supported by this resource. And similarly, we can do for client, and you see that client support a lot of other method which is being supported by, which is not supported by the resource. Okay. Before we move further, let's say I have write a code which is using a resource, right? And I know that now a resource does not support a lot of these functionality, but I want to use a functionality which is provided by the client, which support all the functionality. So I can give you one example. If you look at here, I know this is really difficult to read, but let me go here and I will show you something called describe underscore regions. So if I need to see what are the different regions which is supported by EC2, I can do something called describe region. But if I go to this resource, I do not see this functionality which is available here, describe regions. So let's say I wrote a code using a resource but now I need this functionality called describe region. So anyone know if we can use this functionality using, if I wrote the code using a resource and I want to use some of the functionality which is provided by the client, is there any way is that is possible? Okay, so just in the interest of a time, we have created these two variable, one for resource. Where is that? EC2 underscore resource, I guess. Yes. So in order to use any of the functionality which is available by the client, I need to use something called meta. And now I can use something called describe underscore regions. So using this describe underscore regions, I can see what are the regions which are supported by this particular EC2 instance. Okay. Now, if you see the output here, we can see this curly braces, right? Curly braces is the start and curly braces is the end. And okay, just in the interest of time, because we know in case if we see curly braces in case of Python, this means it is a dictionary, right? Now I try to pass that output, right? Where is that? See here. So I am trying to get all the regions, right? And out of these regions, now because I am doing it on this key region, which was earlier looked like this, right? So region, we have this upper boundary or the upper key, and then we have this all these one. So now I got the output in the form of a list. So I can go over this list like for region in print region. I have now all the regions, right? And if you look at over here, the output of this is now again in the form of a dictionary. So if I need to just to parse this region name, I will get it like this. So that's what I told you earlier. In case of this client, you need to do this extra things. Like you need to parse the output because the output you are getting in the form of a dictionary. You need to do some further processing to get the output out of it. Where in case of like this uh, resources, it is pretty much easy. So let me show you. Let me create a resource for IAM. Okay, and I will say IAM resource dot. You see all the method which is supported by this, and I will say users all. Okay, I get a generator. So I will say for user in. So you see, in case of this, uh, I mean resources, it is pretty much straightforward. That if I need to get the user, I can get it like this. While just to see, and if you need a further refined output, say user dot, you just get all these username. But you see, in case of dictionary, you need to, in case of this client, you need to do this all this further processing. So that's why, in case if resource is available, all those people who are non-programmers, they try to prefer doing to get the information using a resource. But in case if the only way to go with the client, they will, I mean, you need to use a client over there. This way that I've showed you is via the meta, which is doable, but I will not recommend to use a meta because in that case, you will see some unexpected result because you are trying to get the functionality which is not available in the resource. So the recommended way to go or to write your code in Python or to get the information is via using a client rather than using a resource. Then I want to show you one code before we wrap up the today's session. let me ping you guys the code too. So this is one of the requirement we used to encounter in our day-to-day life, especially in a case of a dev environment where we want to save the cost. So let's say uh, every day in the dev environment, I want all of my EC2 instance to be up and running. But at the end of the day, let's say 6 p.m., all the instance should be in the shutdown state. Okay. And this is a simple script to achieve that. So like I showed you, let me use this guy now. And the way, I mean, we have already established a session. So like I showed you, first we need to go to the management console and then we need to select the service. So this is what I'm doing it over here. We are just selecting the service called EC2. Okay. And in order to stop our instance, in case of EC2, we just need to use a method called stop underscore instance. And then you need to supply the instance ID. So let's say this guy, I just need to supply this instance ID. Here. So I need to supply like this. I thought I can supply form of a list. Okay. Now it's trying to stop the instance. If you go here, the instance is now in the stopping state. So what exactly I have done it over here, the same thing which if you ask me to stop an instance, I need to go here, click on this instance state, and then I mean, because this instance is in stopping state, I am not seeing the option of stop, but you should see an option of stop over here, right? Now, the same thing which we have done it over here. We have established a session, okay? And then after that, I use a method called ec2 dot stop underscore instance. And the same way, for example, like I told you, if I need to stop this instance, I need to select this instance and run a stop. So run a stop means using this method. And then I need to supply this instance ID, which you can think in a really layman term that we have supplied this instance ID like this, like selecting it on the UI. Okay. Now the problem with this approach is that, okay, you have done this stop, right? And it immediately you get this response back. But if you look at this EC2 console, it is still in the stopping state. It is not stopped completely. And similarly, if you do the same thing, let me show you ec2 dot start underscore instance. And similarly, you need to give the instance ID. So see, we have started the instance, right? And the status is pending. So if you go here, status is pending. But this is going to be a big challenge. Anyone know what should be the problem over here? The thing is, because you have get this prompt back that, okay, this has started your instance. Now the problem is the moment the instance started and you have those jobs which got triggered out, right? They will think that instance is up and they may redirect the traffic to that particular instance, which is not the case because our instance is still in something called a pending state. It is not ready to accept the traffic. So that's where in Boto3 we have a concept called waiters. Waiters means it is constantly going to check and see if the instance is in running state. So how constantly it is going to check. So the way this waiters works behind the scene is that it is going to do a 15 iteration every 40 seconds. And you will only going to get this prompt back, or it will going to tell your automation, okay, this instance is running state once it see the status actually running, not something which is, it will be in the running state. You get the idea? Like the moment we started the instance, we get the prompt back and say, okay, the instance is up and running. But EC2 instance, behind the scene, it is going into a lot of state, right? It first goes to a pending state and then only it goes to the running state. So we have this concept of something called waiters. I can show you here. Where is that? Waiters. So which has a different value, like instance in running state. I can show you here. Get waiter instance underscore stopped, instance underscore running. There are lot of state. So it either you can write your own loop which say, okay, check this instance. And I know in case of production environment, you are not just going to add the instance back to your primary pool. You by itself going to do some kind of a health check to see if the endpoint is available or not. But this is just for the instance point of view to see if the instance itself is up and running. So there we have this concept of this called waiters, which is going to check if the instance is up, and it is going to check every 15 seconds for 50 iterations, 40 iterations. So basically equal to 600 seconds or 10 minutes. Okay. And that I highly recommend people who is using a script and try to add this functionality of stop or start, that please use waiters so that you will be 100% sure that the instance, only when it is in the running state, is ready to accept the traffic. Okay. So basically, for your own practical things or for your own day-to-day work, you need to understand between the client versus resource. What is the difference between it? And like I mentioned, like most of the functionality is available on the client. So I will suggest you guys to use the client rather than using a resource. I showed you one thing called meta, and using a meta, if you want to use any of the functionality which is available on client and but your code is written on resource, you can use it. The third thing I show you something called waiter. So waiter means if it only going to exit or it is only going to give you a response back if your instance is actually in the stop state or in the running state. Okay. And one more thing which we have discussed, that in case of your client, getting the output back or parsing the output is a little bit complicated because you need to go through a dictionary and parse all those output. But because all the functionality which is available on client, it is recommended to use a client. And we have seen that using a resource is pretty straightforward, that you just need to go through a one for loop, get the value, but resource is not available for each and every services. Okay. I have wrote a lot of code. If you go to this GitHub directory or to my this GitHub one, I mean I have a lot of repository related to the Boto3. So if you want to check any of the code, just give it a try and let me know if you faced any issue.